Welcome to the last installment of Teaching World History using the World History Workbook. I'm David Hertzel, and just as a reminder, this is the workbook, and I don't expect really anybody to follow the discussion very well without having read the material. So I've written in the assignment for each installment as part of the descriptor. I think it should be pretty clear by now, if you've been following through, or if you've read the workbook, or if you've used the workbook, that what I've done with it is I have tried to write a textbook that can be accessible to a broad range of students. My students have been from a wide range of backgrounds, public university students, but also international students, also students who don't have strong educational backgrounds, and then students who do have strong educational backgrounds, grew up in households where they read a lot, students who plan to go on to professional programs and do go on to professional programs and do very well. So that my solution to this really broad range of backgrounds and abilities of students was to write projects and text that was kind of light on information, but heavy on discussion and kind of profound questions. So big questions about human nature, about freedom, about humanism, about the nature of Confucianism, about benevolence in Confucianism, about religion and science. Those big questions that really any person at any level of education can find compelling, and I continue to find compelling and very interesting. And as a result, discussions over the years have been very, very strong, and people are surprised and even amazed at the sophistication of the discussions that we have in world history classes, with students from all kinds of households, all kinds of backgrounds, all kinds of experiences. So the readings are I hope are very accessible. They're very readable. If students came to me and said, well, this class is really hard, I didn't understand the reading, I read it with them. I have read it with them to see what could possibly be hard to read in this book, because I don't think any of it is really that hard to read. I've had parents of high school students write me and say, this book is way beyond what my students can do. And I've had other high school teachers write and say, this seems like fantastic preparation for college. And the same range with university students. I've had seniors who have waited to take their classes and are now nearly professional people themselves, or going on to master's programs, find the class and the material challenging. Challenging is in the sense that it's thought-provoking, because humanity is thought-provoking. Humans have done really remarkable things. They've done terrible things and horrible things. And the range of discussions is as great as the range of human experience, or potentially. This last chapter, or the last two chapters, I'm really discussing the Chapter 8, Globalization, but I'll take a second at the end to discuss the final conclusion as well, which is very short. Really is I think is the most concise, the most tip of the tips. I mean, it just really suggests through these three major themes, nationalism, capitalism, and industrialism, it suggests so many larger themes and trends: globalization, urbanization, democratization, all of those things that come along with these developments that came out of humanism and out of the modern scientific method and out of democratic revolutions of the 19th and 20th centuries. This is how this chapter opens, with several pages of text, beginning on page 153, describing how these forces really became triumphant, but then began to destroy each other or destroy themselves or turn nations against nations because of the competition of capitalism, but also the competition of nationalism and the races of industrialism when linked to a capitalist system or colonial systems led to war, led to the First World War, wars between nations for dominance in the colonial world, in the industrial world, and really in some cases where these nations, industrializing democratic nations, tried to colonize the other industrial democratizing nations, or the empires that were moving into the industrial age. So first couple of pages sort of lead up to this Ruth Comfort Mitchell poem, which I think is really a brilliant model for literature of the First World War. So again, this is just a poem that covers a page and a half in this text. It's quite brief, but almost every element that you could find in All Quiet on the Western Front or in many of the great pieces of literature that came out of the First World War, you could find those elements in this poem. So I thought of this as kind of representative of all of that literature and of that mentality and the culture of despair and the lost generation, all of that, all themes that could come up in a discussion or with additional assignments. I usually didn't offer additional assignments, and students would sometimes ask, what else can I read? And I would make suggestions as we would have discussions. But I would want students to not bite off more than they could chew in this class. I didn't want to overburden students. I didn't want to compete with other classes. I know that a lot of modern college students also have jobs, and they have grandmothers they take care of, and they have to pay taxes, and they have to pay their bills, and they have cars they have to maintain. The modern world is very complicated, and it's a complex life that students have to navigate. A lot of them are new at those lives as well. So it's a lot to do. So what my goal in this class and in this discussion as well was often really to provide them something that they could think about, that they could apply to their own lives, that they could apply to their own friendships, to their peer groups, their institutions, their career hopes, their thoughts on society and citizenship and humanity, to give them something to think about for each class and from each reading. Not to stuff them full of the history of the entire world and all the people of the world. I don't really even see the point in that. Students forget those things, particularly after the test. They start forgetting these things quite rapidly, all of the information that people teach them in those encyclopedic classes. So I never thought of that as being very valuable, except maybe as in the sense that it's a discipline, and they learn the discipline of memorization. But I just didn't think that was the most useful way that we could put a class together for them. So I wanted them to have something to think about. And of course, there's always been wars. I taught through the Iraq War and numerous other wars going on in the world. And so I think that this model from the First World War asks a lot of questions. And those lead up to the project, which is Project 31 on page 157, Accountability in Ruth Comfort Mitchell's poem. A lot of students, I think particularly American students, like to fall back on this kind of I don't know how to describe it, anarchist mentality that by nature everybody is so individual that we make all of our own decisions and we make all of our own choices on our own, independent of the world around us, and we are completely responsible for those decisions. But that just isn't the way the world works. It's not the way human beings work. People learn things from other people. People are pressured by elements in their society. People are compelled through all kinds of means, economic and social and cultural means, to behave in a certain way, to follow certain trends, to sign up for the military and go to war. And what Ruth Comfort Mitchell does in this poem is she's very sympathetic to this young man, Billy the soldier, and you might be aware that her brother served in the war, in the First World War. And what she does is she really kind of paints a picture where all of these elements the girls, the singing, the flowers, the patriotism, the state, the parade, his friends, it all leads to him signing up. And he goes to war, and he has really a gruesome experience, and she shows how horrible it is. And while he's lying there dying in the mud, he's wondering, now, what did I come here for? What was I doing? What were all of those flowers for? I was supposed to come home by Christmas and be rewarded and showered with laurels, but he wasn't. So I think that this very conventional outline of the experience of the First World War is really helpful to students to get a little perspective on society. That societies aren't made up of a billion hyper-individualized entities which just behave in their own best interest without concern and consideration for people or institutions or traditions or language around them, because that isn't how people operate. And it's a psychological question, it's a sociological question, it's a historical question. And it doesn't only apply to the First World War, it applies to human behavior right up to the present. What are the pressures on our students? What are the pressures on you if you're taking this class, on you to behave a certain way? And how do you get some objectivity into those pressures? Ruth Comfort Mitchell has a little more objectivity maybe than her brother might have had, or than the subject of her poem had. The text then goes on to describe really the massively destructive wars of the 20th century, unlike anything anybody had ever seen. World War was not an exaggeration. The world was at war, particularly with the Second World War. And in the First World War, these empires were transformed into national states very violently. In the Second World War, these national states were cut up, and colonies were separated, and there was parts of large swaths of Europe were completely wiped out. Large swaths of Japan and China were just completely destroyed, and people rebuilt. In both of these, after both of these wars, there were international efforts to have international institutions that could monitor the behavior of countries. After the First World War, of course, it was the League of Nations, and after the Second World War, it was the United Nations. And there's some discussion about this as the hope for peace. Whether it was successful or not is a fair question, but increasingly through the 19th and 20th centuries, as a consequence and continuation of industrialism, nationalism, and capitalism, the world really recognizes increasingly that it has a shared fate, that my fate is closely linked to the people of Brazil and the people of Spain and the people of India, and their fate is closely linked to the people of China, who are closely linked to the people of Japan, and so on. People all around the world, if they like it or not, no matter how isolationist they try to be, because the world is globalizing in so many ways, not only economically, but in so many ways that people are becoming a single entity, like we were back at Blambos Cave and early days in Africa, back in the good old days in early Africa. Well, it's always been true in an abstract way, or in a genetic way, or in a linguistic way, that people are all the same people, just different expressions of the same thing. But now, in the sense of an environment, in the sense of a warfare, in the sense of feeding the world and a world market, we become smaller and smaller and smaller. This is something that just can't really be stopped, and this is a great opportunity for discussion. Globalization is something that students understand. It may require the instructor and the text to put it together into a cohesive term and a cohesive concept, but there's no element to it that they don't understand. They're online, they're on the internet, they're buying goods made in Japan and China. They're well aware of who these companies are, where these companies are located, of pressures and tensions between companies and countries, and the individual and the consumer and the companies, and I mean all of these things, the markets. Our students are well aware of these things, and people travel so much now, maybe not during COVID, but pre-COVID and then hopefully post-COVID. People travel so much that students have been many places, or in the classroom there are people from all over the world. So the students are well aware that, and don't have a lot of trouble understanding that there are groups and people who object to various aspects of globalization, and yet globalization is moving ahead with very little serious resistance because of capitalism and industrialism. Those elements, there's no slowing down the technological advances. This just continues at a rapid pace, and the freeing and opening of world markets, it kind of moves in a stutter, but overall it advances. The European Union is a great example. So there's still a lot of national tension within the European Union, but there's also a European Union, and there's a euro, and the euro is quite successful. And there may be, today it's England and tomorrow it's the Danes or whatever, but the people who are not particularly happy with the euro or not particularly happy with free trade and free trade agreements, unions may resist it, and working groups may resist it, and some politicians may resist it, but it's still not slowing down. It's not really going anywhere. So I think that Bill Clinton's Bill Clinton's speech is really a wonderful perspective, that we need to cooperate. We just don't have a lot of choice. All this new diversity, he calls it. It's really a wonderful speech. So the text looks at nationalism and the fate of nationalist movement and hyper-nationalism in Germany, which led to the Second War and the massive destruction. Then on page 165 is Project 32, the challenge of the 21st century, which is really these are questions about Bill Clinton's speech given at the Bob Dole Institute, but they're obviously questions. These are obviously questions about the function of a nation state in the modern globalizing world, about the state of cooperation and trade and all this new diversity. So question one, I think, is really an opportunity for students just to discuss some of these terms. Question two is all this new diversity. Question three is asked a question about humanism. How is this humanism? And the idea is, I think, basically that globalization is a consequence of the humanist narrative or the humanist cycles and developments because of freedom and the scientific method. So reason and freedom and the application of those into governments, into laws, into states, into research, into universities, into education, all of those things. How does Clinton say the United States needs to cooperate institutionally? Of course, it seems clear we do, but he outlines a way to do that. And also he outlines, I think, very instructively, what are the limits when he didn't go along with the landmine treaty because he felt like it singled out the United States. Well, that's a good example of the function of the president and the function of the state to protect the nation. This is how he saw it, right or wrong. This is how he saw it. He saw his job is to protect the people of the United States and to protect the society of the United States. So even something, this was one of Lady Di's big causes, was landmines. It's obviously a terrible thing that there are landmines scattered all over the world, and yet he wouldn't sign it because he felt like the landmine agreement, in the form in which it was, he found it when he was president, targeted the United States. Project 2020 is question 5, and again, globalization, a consequence of humanist thought. A little bit repetitive, but that's okay. I'd rather have them chewing on the same thing over and over again and thinking about the same thing from different perspectives, and then grasping something intelligent, sophisticated, useful, applicable. And I think they can do that. I know they can do that. I've watched them do that for 20 years. Students of all ranges. The university where I have taught really has a very, very typical range of students. I mean, the top students are outstanding and go on to become professors and doctors and lawyers and so on. The students with the weakest, and by weakest I usually mean reading. I mean, reading really seems to be the determinant. A lot of you who are teachers and instructors and professors probably would agree with me that students who grow up in households where people read and talk about reading, they just show up better prepared. Now that isn't always true. That isn't always true. They show, but their language skills are better, their writing skills are better, their confidence is better, and they have a lot of references. So finally, with the conclusion, there's a brief statement on how history is, and studying history is like the Silk Road. I think it's kind of nice, and it's a good conclusion. Then the last project, You the Migrants. I think that it's clear that this also serves several purposes at one time. I have to apologize for it in a certain way because it is a question about genealogy, or it could be a question about genealogy. It doesn't have to be. There's a lot of different ways that people answer this question, and it's open to a lot of different descriptions. But genealogy is not history. Genealogy is different from history. Genealogy is, my perception of my personal story and so on. But I kind of wanted to close with this to bring the story back to the students. And I know how much people love discussing their own ancestry and how much ancestry informs identity. So I thought that this would be a nice project to close with, to give them kind of a boost on the way out of the class. Now they're describing their own history in a historical setting. So what migrations brought you here, it's not just what people brought you here, but what migrations, and that everybody is a child or a grandchild of migrations. And along the way, the students, when they write their answers to these, will oftentimes place themselves in historical contexts and place their families in historical settings. So this integrates them at the end. This integrates them into the historical narrative of the world. They really are part of world history, and their family is part of world history, and their grandparents and their ancestors, they are integrated into the history of humanity. They are part of that, and they can describe that. Now, I got a lot of very interesting answers for this, not all of them historically accurate. I actually published an article on I believe it was 464, 462, something like that, answers that I accumulated over a period of years, maybe over 10 years, because a lot of them were just really, really interesting. And cumulatively, they provided a wonderful insight into the way that young people in particular, but the way that people understand their identities as descendants. And it was published, if you're interested, in World History Connected, a peer-reviewed online historical journal. I can't tell you the year. It was a few years ago. So it's not hard to find. Just type in my name and World History Connected, and I think you'll find it there. The idea of migrants and that everybody is a migrant is also a lesson. It's plainly true. It's irrefutable that all people are descended from migrants and migrations. Even if a person is adopted, that person knows that he or she came from people who came out of Africa. And then from the color of the person's skin or the color of the person's eyes, they may have some idea through which continent the people came. And then the person came to this town to study, and they know how their parents got here, or how they got here. And those are all migrations. I have had students over the years say, I didn't migrate at all. My people have always been here. But then they'll go on to say they arrived on the trails of tears in the 1840s or whatever. And so obviously those are also migrations. The question is not about are you an American or are you a citizen today or do you have a community? It's not so much about that. It's about the reality that all people are migrants and that all people come from somewhere, and that is the story of history, that we and what we do and what we believe and what we teach all comes from somewhere. And it's important to learn how to look at that critically and accountably. I hope you enjoyed these lessons and these talks, and I hope that it helps you with the book and helps you with the material, and thank you for watching.